Well, thank you very much for coming. One of the things that you'll see behind me is just a slideshow of some of the images that we took from the boat during our cruise. If you have any specific questions about any of the slides, when I open it up for questions, please feel free to ask, and we can stop and go back to that. But as of now, they're just serving as some colorful background. What I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of the motivation for our research, why I believe that the National Science Foundation was interested in it and provided our funding. And then I'd also like to give you some of our preliminary findings. One of the things that came to us early on in this disaster was that the concentration of natural gas and methane emanating from the broken riser pipe was rather high. It's approximately 40% by weight. And these are analyses that BP has been doing now for a few weeks and has been publishing those results. Once we received that information, that gave us then some insight into some of the problems that we study normally in our laboratory. What we're interested in is looking at the oceanic methane system. Methane and natural gas is incredibly abundant in the ocean reservoir. It's one of not only the largest reservoirs, it's not only the largest reservoir of methane on the planet, it's so large it's one of the largest carbon reservoirs on the entire planet. And there certainly has been some geological evidence that there has been some large and abrupt eruptions of methane and natural gas from the seafloor in the geologic past, which has contributed to the changing of the Earth's climate as a system. So once we heard this information, we thought, wow, this is an incredible opportunity for us to go out and then study where this methane might have gone and how it might have actually cycled in the environment during one of these eruptions in the past. It also gave us some insight into two other what I like to call sub-hypotheses. There's a lot of work that goes on at Texas A&M as well as some other universities studying what's called the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And these are regions where the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water has decreased, decreases during certain months to get to a critically low level. And the teams that go out and study this routinely are attempting to determine what controls these hypoxic or low oxygen zones. Well, now pumping in all of this oil and natural gas into the waters, what might that do to oxygen loss in these regions? The Gulf of Mexico is a very energetic region where there's a lot of natural gas and oil naturally just emanating from the seafloor and going into the water. So does this spill then highlight the possibility that those natural sources of oil and gas contribute to these hypoxic zones? That was another issue that we were going out to investigate. And those were really the two issues that the National Science Foundation had funded us to go study. Now, in any sort of opportunity like this, especially one which is mobilized so rapidly, you try to investigate as many different angles as you can. And there was another principal investigator that was funded by the National Science Foundation, not at Texas A&M, but from the University of California, Santa Barbara, that was funded to study oil degradation by microbiology life that's naturally in the waters. And he joined us on our cruise as well. But one of his working hypotheses, for which he had published an opinion paper about it just a few weeks before our cruise, was that you could actually use methane as a way to quantify the size of the oil spill. So while our original proposal was not to go out and actually quantify the size of the spill, nonetheless, the data that we collected should give us some preliminary insights into the actual size of the spill. Now that effort, the actual quantification of the size of the spill, I do want to stress on how what we did, the measurements that we made in our time, just give us some preliminary estimates of that. To really do that well requires a multi-vessel effort on a much longer time scale, not just 10 days at sea, but possibly 2 months at sea during that multi-vessel effort. It also depends on actually how long this spill takes to appropriately sample and determine those sorts of findings. So those were really the three issues that we were working under. How this methane emissions might have simulated some events in the past and what it might tell us in terms of the eruptions in the future. What it might mean in terms of the dissolved oxygen levels in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And finally, could our results give us some preliminary estimates onto the actual size of this spill? Now, we collected, as we were out for approximately 10 days, including a little bit of setup time at the dock before we left, some breakdown time when we returned. We were on the water for about 8 solid days. We had a team of 11 scientists on board with a marine technician that was supplied by the research vessel, the Cape Hatteras, that we were on. We had about 12 working scientists on board. The team that I had, to be quite honest, the team could not have worked any better, any harder, or any smarter during our brief time at sea. I could not have mobilized such an effort in such a short period of time to collect the data that we did without the team that we had. They worked fantastically. In terms of specific findings, so when we were out there, not only did we collect samples to return to the laboratory for some more sophisticated analyses, but we try to measure as much as we can at sea so that we get a true idea of what these samples are telling us. Based on, now, just in terms of a timeline a little bit, we returned to College Station, Texas last night at about 10 p.m. And so we have unloaded our equipment and our samples into the laboratory right now. We will be beginning our laboratory analyses on the samples that we collected almost immediately. And so what I'd like to talk about today are some of the preliminary findings from the measurements that we made at sea. What those measurements at sea tell us is that the concentration of methane and some of the other components of natural gas, specifically ethane and propane, in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico are astonishingly high. I would put estimates on it anywhere, now this varies obviously depending on where we looked, but it was anywhere from about 10,000 times above the background concentrations to 100,000 times above background concentrations, and even in very, very concentrated zones, very, very hot spots, we saw them approaching 1 million times above background concentrations. Where we were working was in typically a 5-mile radius of ground zero. The quarantined zone is that 5-mile radius. We were granted permission on 2 separate events to breach that 5-mile limit. The closest that we got to ground zero was 500 meters, which is about 1/3 of a mile. So we were able to sample some of the waters that were very, very close. So our concentration numbers then are from anywhere from very, very close to upwards of about 6 or 7 miles away from ground zero, encircling most of the areas where we saw deep subsurface plumes. The surface waters themselves, which we studied for us to be able to determine how much of this methane and natural gas is actually making it into the atmosphere, were remarkably low. I had anticipated that those concentrations in that region would be actually quite high, given how much methane and natural gas is coming out. They were surprisingly low. They were slightly above background, but normally not more than about a factor of 2.